A woman was murdered inside a locked restaurant on a freezing Pennsylvania morning. The man who did it, he was not a stranger, he was not a suspect. And for 15 years, he was free. This is the story of Terry Lynn Brooks, and this is Crime Testament. Okay, take a look at this. February 4th, 1984. Falls Township, Pennsylvania, 6 o'clock in the morning. A day manager arrives at a Roy Rogers restaurant on Lincoln Highway to open for the breakfast shift. Standard morning, keys in hand, nothing unusual from the outside. He steps through the door, and the morning stops. On the kitchen floor, face up, still in her winter coat, was the night manager, 25 years old. Her name was Terry Lynn Brooks. She had stayed behind after closing the night before to finish paperwork. The same routine, every Friday night. This Friday, she never made it home. Now here is where investigators start building their picture, and where the first crack appears. The physical evidence from that scene told a very specific story. The safe behind the front counter, open, empty. Roughly $2,500 in cash, gone. The drive-through window, partially open. Every other exterior door, locked. No broken glass, no damaged frames, no sign of forced entry anywhere on the building. To the officers who walked into that kitchen, the picture looked familiar. A lone woman working late, a fast food safe, cash missing, quick exit through a window. By hour 1, investigators had their theory. This was a robbery that had gone wrong. That theory would hold for the next 15 years, and it would take 15 years to prove how wrong it was. Stay with me here, because this is where the evidence starts to push back. The coroner's findings came back precise. Terry had been struck, restrained, and a kitchen knife had been driven into her throat with significant force. But here is what the coroner confirmed that changed everything about how investigators should have read this scene. The stab wound was not the cause of death. It had incapacitated her, but it had not killed her. A plastic trash bag had been placed over her head while she was still conscious, and her official cause of death was asphyxiation. Every stage of what happened in that kitchen happened in sequence, deliberately. This was not a robbery that spun out of control in 30 seconds. This took time, and whoever was in that kitchen had time to spend. Now watch this, because this detail is the one that survives the entire 15 years. When investigators processed Terry's body, they found something under her fingernails. Skin tissue. There was also a defensive wound on her right ring finger. Terry had fought back. She had clawed at whoever was attacking her, and she had pulled something from them with her own hands. In 1984, that tissue could not be tested. DNA profiling did not exist yet in any practical forensic capacity. So investigators did the only responsible thing they could. They preserved it carefully, sealed it, and placed it in an evidence locker, where it would sit, untouched, for the next 15 years. Alongside it, 15 fingerprints lifted from the scene, run through every available database, matched to no one. 200 witness statements would follow, 90 pieces of physical evidence logged, and still, no name. But here is the detail that should have redirected this investigation from day one. Go back to the building. Every exterior door, locked. The drive-through window, partially open. No forced entry, anywhere. For a stranger to have gotten into that building, they would have needed to break something. Nothing was broken. Which means the only way into that restaurant was through a door that someone on the inside opened. Terry Brooks let her killer in. She opened the door herself, for someone she recognized. Someone she trusted enough to let into a locked building at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Every exterior door was locked, no glass broken, no frame pried, no window forced. Terry Brooks opened that door herself. She let her killer in. And for 15 years, nobody asked why. If you are watching Crime Testament for the first time, hit subscribe right now. Because the evidence hiding in plain sight since 1984 is exactly what this channel is built to find. Stay with us. It only gets deeper from here. Here is what a serious investigation looks like from the outside. 200 witness statements collected, 90 pieces of physical evidence logged, 15 fingerprints lifted and processed. Falls Township Police put real resources into this case from the moment that Kitchen was processed. The problem was not effort. The problem was direction. And from hour one, the direction was wrong. The first name investigators looked at was a man named Steve Daly. He had worked at the Roy Rogers as a cook until Terry let him go. The reason for the termination was not minor. Daly had thrown a violent tantrum in the kitchen and directed a threatening slur at Terry in front of other staff members. She fired him, but being fired did not make him stay away. He kept coming back to the restaurant as a customer, sitting in the dining area, making his presence felt in ways that made Terry uncomfortable. Co-workers noticed it. Management noticed it. When investigators brought him in, his alibi for the night of the murder was not clean, but he agreed to a polygraph, and he passed it. Without enough to hold him, detectives moved on. First lead closed. 2 weeks after Terry's murder, the case shifted. A female assistant manager at a nearby Roy Rogers location was attacked by an unknown man who came out of the bathroom while she was closing alone. She survived. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. A woman, working alone, a Roy Rogers, after closing hours. 1 week after that, approximately 130 miles northwest, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a lone female employee at a different restaurant was attacked after closing. The man waited until she was alone, demanded access to the safe, and when she could not comply, he stabbed her. She did not survive. Scranton investigators had a suspect, a man named Steve Duffy. Falls Township obtained his fingerprints and ran them against the 15 prints lifted from Terry's scene. No match. Both attacks, after full investigation, turned out to be completely unrelated to what happened at the Fairless Hills restaurant. But the damage to this case was already done. The serial predator theory had taken root. It had a logic to it that felt solid on the surface. Women working alone, fast food locations, late-night attacks, cash taken. The pattern looked real. And so investigators pointed the entire case outward, toward an unknown predator, toward restaurant patterns, toward a stranger who moved between locations and targeted vulnerability. Every lead that followed chased that theory. And every lead went nowhere. Because the man who killed Terry Lynn Brooks was not a stranger targeting random women in fast food restaurants. He was someone who knew exactly where she would be, and exactly when she would be alone. Scott Keith was interviewed early in the investigation. Standard procedure. He was her fiancé, closest person to her, first circle, always interviewed. He told investigators he had not gone to the restaurant that night because he had an early work shift the following morning. Terry's family described him as loving and attentive. He had an alibi. The family supported his account, and there was nothing in the initial interview that raised a flag investigators were equipped to see at the time. He was cleared. Routine elimination. Case moved forward, and Scott Keith went back to his life. By the mid-1980s, every thread had unraveled. The fingerprints matched no one. The serial predator theory had collapsed. Steve Daly had passed his polygraph. The Scranton connection was dead. The skin tissue preserved under Terry's fingernails sat in an evidence locker with no technology in existence capable of reading it. The case went cold. The file was boxed. The 90 pieces of evidence were sealed. The 200 witness statements were stored. And the investigation, officially, had no more moves to make. Inside the Brooks family, the cold case landed differently depending on who you asked. George Brooks had watched investigators work this case for over a year. He believed they had done their job. The answers simply had not come. He accepted that. Not easily, but he accepted it. Betty Brooks did not. She never said it publicly. She never brought it to investigators. But something about the way this case had closed left a feeling she could not set down. She did not have evidence. She did not have a name. She just had a feeling that the answer was closer than anyone was looking. George and Betty carried the loss differently. That difference sat between them quietly for the next decade. Neither of them was wrong. The truth was just not ready to surface yet. By 1985, the file was sealed. And a man who had sat in the Brooks family kitchen the morning after the murder had simply gone back to living his life. For 10 more years, nobody looked at him twice. But in 1998, a retired police chief made one decision that changed everything. And he did not make it alone. 14 years. That is how long this case had been sitting still when Arnold Connelly became the new police chief of Falls Township in 1998. He looked at the file. He looked at what was sitting in that evidence locker. And he made a decision that nobody before him had made. He ordered the case reopened. And here is why that decision mattered more in 1998 than it would have at any point before it. In 1984, DNA profiling did not exist as a usable forensic tool. By the late 1990s, that had completely changed. Forensic DNA testing had advanced to the point where trace biological material, preserved correctly, could now produce a profile specific enough to identify a single individual. The skin tissue recovered from under Terry's fingernails in February of 1984 had been preserved carefully and stored in a sealed evidence locker for 14 years. It was still viable. For the first time since the night Terry was killed, that evidence had somewhere to go. But Connelly did not stop at just reopening the file and ordering DNA tests. He did something no one in Falls Township had done before. He brought the case to Philadelphia. The Vidocq Society is not a government agency. It is not a task force. It carries no official jurisdiction. What it is a private organization of retired forensic professionals who meet once a month in a Victorian dining room in Philadelphia and solve murders that nobody else could crack. Forensic psychologists, retired homicide detectives, evidence specialists, people who had spent entire careers working violent crime and were not finished. They reviewed one cold case per meeting. They charged nothing. And by the time Falls Township brought them the Terry Brooks file, they had already built a reputation for seeing what overworked local departments had missed. Connelly presented the case. 14 years of dead ends. The robbery theory, the serial predator angle, the fingerprints that matched no one, the evidence that could not be read. Everything laid out on the table, in that dining room, in front of people who had seen a lot of crime scenes. One of them was a forensic psychologist named Richard Walter. He sat through the entire presentation. He did not interrupt. He listened to every detail, every dead end, every piece of evidence that had led nowhere. And when investigators finished, Walter stood up and told them plainly, they had been investigating the wrong crime. This is where it gets precise, so stay with me. Walter's position was not a gut feeling. It was a forensic reading of the physical evidence. He explained what robbery crime scenes actually look like. A robber's goal is simple. Get the money, get out. Speed matters. Efficiency matters. Lingering at the scene creates exposure and risk. A real robbery gone wrong produces a certain kind of evidence, and a certain level of violence consistent with that goal. What happened in that kitchen did not match that model. Walter said it directly. A robber is simply not going to do that. It's not efficient. There's no value in that kind of activity. Hundrate. The level of force used, the sequence of events the coroner had confirmed, the time that had to have been spent in that kitchen, none of it reflected a stranger after cash. It reflected someone with a personal investment in what was happening. The open safe, the missing cash, the drive-through window. Walter called it exactly what it was, clumsy staging. Designed to redirect investigators toward a stranger, and away from someone who knew Terry. Someone who had been in that building before. Someone who had a reason to be there that night that had nothing to do with $2,500 in a safe. His direction to investigators was specific. Stop chasing strangers. Go back to the people closest to Terry. Specifically, anyone who had been pushed away by her in the weeks before she died. In one afternoon, a theory that had guided the investigation for nearly 15 years was gone. Investigators went back to the original file, pulled every name, every statement, every connection to Terry's personal life. And in that process, a name came up that had never been in the investigation at all. Cindy Bradney. She had been one of Terry's closest friends, a former co-worker from a job before the Roy Rogers, someone who existed completely outside the original investigative circle. When investigators reached her and sat her down, What she told them had been sitting with her for 15 years. She said the relationship between Terry and Scott Keith had become a serious problem in the months before the murder. Keith was jealous, he was possessive, and it had gotten worse after Terry took the night manager position. Those regular drive-bys past the restaurant, the check-in calls, making sure she was safe. Cindy said none of that was about Terry's safety. It was about keeping track of her, monitoring who she spoke to, making sure she stayed within the boundaries he had set. And then Cindy told investigators the detail that reframed everything. The week before the murder, Terry had told Cindy she wanted to call off the wedding. She did not know how to tell him, she was not sure how he would react. And she never got the chance to find out on her own terms. Richard Walter had told investigators, look for someone close to her, someone who felt rejected, someone who could not accept being pushed away. Cindy Bradney had just described that person by name. The personal rage Walter identified in the crime scene, the rejection, the staged robbery. Point for point, the forensic profile and the personal testimony matched. For the first time since February of 1984, the investigation had a real suspect. Not a theory, not a pattern, a name. Everything Terry's closest friend had been carrying for 15 years matched exactly what a forensic expert pulled from the crime scene in one afternoon. Because what investigators do next, how they get his DNA without him ever knowing, is one of the most precise pieces of detective work in this entire case. Chapter 4 is where 15 years of waiting finally gets an answer. Don't miss it. Investigators now had a name. What they did not have yet was evidence that could put him in that kitchen. The DNA preserved under Terry's fingernails needed something to be tested against. To get that, they needed Keith's DNA. And they needed to get it without him knowing they were looking at him. The first step was finding him. Keith had been off the radar for years, but investigators caught a break they were not expecting. A recent DUI arrest in another jurisdiction had generated a current address. Warminster, Pennsylvania, living with his brother, Charles Keith. Investigators did not move immediately. They began surveillance first, watching the house, mapping his routine, learning his patterns without making a single approach. And during that surveillance, they noticed something useful. Keith was a smoker, and like most smokers, he discarded his cigarette butts in the trash outside the house. That detail, as small as it sounds, was the opening investigators needed. Here is why cigarette butts are forensically significant. Saliva deposited on a cigarette filter contains DNA. If that material is collected before it degrades, before weather or time breaks it down, it can be tested and produce a viable profile. Officer Nelson Whitney executed the collection. Before the trash was picked up, Whitney pulled the discarded butts from outside the house. Clean collection. No contact with Keith. No alert to the suspect that anything was happening. But investigators needed one more piece before they could run the test. Charles Keith, Scott's brother, lived in the same house. If biological material from two people had potentially been deposited in the same trash, the test needed a comparison sample to eliminate Charles as a possible source. Investigators obtained cigarette butts from Charles separately, at a restaurant, keeping the collection clean and controlled. Now they had everything they needed. The saliva from Scott Keith's cigarette butts was sent to the lab and tested against the skin tissue that had been sitting in that Falls Township evidence locker since February of 1984. Charles Keith came back negative. Scott Keith came back positive. 15 years. The biological material Terry had taken from her killer with her own hands, in the final moments of her life, had just produced a confirmed DNA match to the man who had been standing in her family's kitchen the morning her father found out she was gone. A DNA match of this kind does not suggest presence at a scene. It confirms it. Skin cells transferred during a physical struggle cannot be explained by casual contact, cannot be explained by a shared space, cannot be explained by coincidence. The evidence said he was there, he was in contact with her, and she had fought back against him. Now it was time to sit him down and see what he would do with that information. February 5th, 1999. 15 years, and 1 day after Terry Brooks was murdered. Alfred Scott Keith was brought in for questioning at the Falls Township Police Station. He was 37 years old. To anyone watching him walk into that building, he looked like a man with nothing to worry about. Calm, composed, cooperative. He sat down and told investigators exactly what he had told them 15 years earlier. He had not gone to the restaurant that night. He had an early shift the next morning. He had nothing to do with what happened to Terry. The story was clean, rehearsed, consistent. Then investigators told him about the DNA. The skin tissue preserved under Terry's fingernails since 1984 had been matched to saliva collected from cigarette butts pulled from his own trash. The room shifted. Keith agreed to take a polygraph. He failed it. After the results came back, the conversation changed. The story he had maintained for 15 years began to develop cracks. Small ones at first, but cracks. He said he hadn't meant for it to happen, then caught himself and pulled back. Investigators kept the pressure steady. Let the silence work. Let him fill the space. And then, he said something that stopped the room cold. "She came at me first." 5 words. And in those 5 words, Scott Keith had placed himself inside that restaurant on the night Terry was killed, for the first time in 15 years. There was no version of that statement that put him anywhere else. From that moment, the interrogation had only one direction. What came out next was the account he had spent 15 years keeping to himself. He told investigators he had gone to the Roy Rogers late that night, deliberately. Not randomly, not impulsively. He had gone there because Terry had been distant, and he believed she was going to end the engagement. He went to confront her after the other employees had left. And Terry, who had no reason to expect a threat from the man she was engaged to, let him in through the locked door. The detail that had sat unanswered since 1984 finally had an explanation. She trusted him. She opened the door, and he walked in. They argued. Terry told him the engagement was over, that she did not want to marry him, and Keith could not accept it. The physical confrontation that followed, the injuries the coroner documented, the sequence of events in that kitchen, Keith confirmed all of it. He confirmed that after everything that had already happened, he could see she was still alive, and he made a choice to finish it. He did not describe it as panic. He did not describe it as accident. He confirmed the sequence, deliberately, step by step, the way someone describes a decision they made and then spent 15 years pretending they hadn't. After Terry was dead, Keith moved through the restaurant with a purpose that had nothing to do with grief. He opened the safe. He took the cash. He pushed the drive-through window open just enough to suggest an exit point. Then he climbed out and left every exterior door locked behind him, so that when the day manager arrived, the scene would say robbery. And it did. For 15 years, it did. Then he told investigators about the next morning. Going to the Brooks family home, standing at that door, sitting in that kitchen, was not grief. It was not worry. It was not concern for a family he cared about. It was calculated positioning. He went there specifically to be present when the news broke, to be standing inside the family's pain, above suspicion, surrounded by people who had no reason not to trust him. That one morning, that single performance, bought him 15 years. He had planned every detail, the staging, the alibi, the performance at the family home. What he had not planned for was a woman who fought back hard enough to take something from him, and kept it for 15 years. Now all that was left was what a courtroom would do with it. The confession was on record, the DNA match was confirmed, the staging had been admitted. Now the legal system had to decide what to do with all of it. Alfred Scott Keith was formally charged with first-degree murder and robbery. District Attorney Alan Rubenstein addressed the charges publicly and announced that prosecutors would be seeking the death penalty. He described what had happened inside that restaurant as one of the most brutal, heinous, and malicious homicides he had encountered in his career. First-degree murder carries a specific legal threshold. It requires the prosecution to prove that the killing was intentional, that it was premeditated, and that the defendant acted with a conscious decision to kill. The evidence in this case met that threshold on multiple points. Keith had gone to that restaurant deliberately, He had waited until the other employees left. He had entered through a door Terry opened for him. And by his own account, at the moment he saw she was still alive, he made a deliberate choice to ensure she did not survive. That is not accident. That is not impulse that spiraled beyond control. That is premeditation, confirmed by the person who carried it out. The confession, combined with the DNA match, combined with the forensic profile Richard Walter had built from the crime scene, made this case about as airtight as a prosecution gets. When the arrest was announced, the Brooks family finally had something they had been waiting 15 years to receive. Betty Brooks spoke to reporters. She said, "I thought he was involved all along. My husband did not." That was not bitterness. That was not performance. That was a woman who had carried a quiet conviction for 15 years and had just been told she was right. Betty also shared a detail she had held on to since the weeks just after the funeral. Approximately 2 weeks after Terry was buried, Keith had made a point of telling the family he had a date. That is a fact, not an editorial. A man who had sat in that family's kitchen the morning they learned Terry was gone was telling them he was already seeing someone before the ground had settled over her grave. In the 15 years between the murder and the arrest, Keith had not disappeared. He had gotten married, had a child, gone through a divorce, and eventually moved back to Falls Township, the same township where George and Betty Brooks still lived. Same roads, same area, different lives, separated by what one of them knew and the other two were still trying to find an answer to. In 2000, Keith entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder and robbery. The plea was a calculated decision, the same instinct that had driven everything he had done since February of 1984. By pleading guilty, he avoided a full trial. He avoided the death penalty. On June 6, 2000, in Bucks County Court, Alfred Scott Keith was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He made a brief statement before sentencing. Minimal remorse, no real explanation. Nothing of substance about why 15 years had passed without him saying a word. The guilty plea was the last meaningful thing he said in a courtroom about the murder of Terry Lynn Brooks. The people who had worked this case spoke after the sentencing. Detective Steve Connor had spent 7 years on the cold case after it was reopened in 1998. 7 years, on a single case, alongside everything else a working detective carries. After the sentencing, he said, "7 years of working on it pretty much wore me out. I'm pretty excited about the decision." Police Chief Arnold Connelline, the man who had ordered the reopening, who had brought the file to Philadelphia, who had trusted that the evidence in that locker still had something to say, said simply, "It was great to bring the case to a close. We hopefully gave the family some peace." For Betty Brooks, the sentencing delivered something specific. "I was shocked, and then I was relieved. Now we can go on with some closure." Not healed, not whole. Closure, which is the most that a conviction can realistically offer a family that lost someone the way they lost Terry. So let's put this case back together one final time, through the facts. Terry Lynn Brooks graduated cum laude from the University of Maryland in 1980. She chose an industry she loved over the career her degree was built for. She had been recently promoted. She was engaged. She had a honeymoon deposit on Hawaii. She had a summer wedding planned. She was 25 years old, and she was building something. On the night of February 3, 1984, she stayed late to do paperwork the way she did every Friday. She opened a door for someone she trusted. And she fought back. Hard enough, and with enough presence of mind, to leave biological evidence on the person attacking her. That evidence survived 14 years in a locker. It survived the collapse of every wrong theory investigators had chased. It survived the cold case years. It survived Keith's marriage, his child, his divorce, his quiet return to Falls Township. It took a police chief willing to reopen a sealed file, a room full of forensic professionals who saw what 15 years of conventional thinking had missed. A friend who had been waiting for someone to finally ask her what she knew, and a cigarette butt pulled from a trash can on a street in Warminster. But the evidence itself, the evidence that closed this case, Terry collected that on her own, in that kitchen, in February of 1984, with her own hands. Terry Lynn Brooks solved her own murder. She just needed someone to finally ask the right question. If that is the kind of story that deserves to be told, subscribe to Crime Testament right now. Every week, we go back into the cases the wrong answers buried. Hit the bell, share this video, and make sure the next story finds the people who need to hear it. I'll see you on the next one.